Hello, learners. We are going to be reading aloud the article Who Eats Whom from the unit Ecosystems and Their Interactions. An ecosystem contains many distinct populations of organisms, and they all need energy to live. Where does this energy come from? Is it provided to each organism through its food, which contains packets of energy stored in chemical bonds. The energy in the chemical bonds of food originally came from sunlight. Some organisms in an ecosystem use sunlight to create sugars that they break apart for energy. Other organisms consume organisms to get their energy. In an ecosystem, populations of organisms can be categorized by how they get their food. Organisms make their own food. Autotrophs are organisms that can make their own food. Plants, algae, and some bacteria make food for themselves through photosynthesis. As you already know, photosynthesis is the process by which autotrophs turn carbon dioxide and water into sugars in the presence of light. The energy in the sugars can then be used by the plant to make all the molecules they need. These molecules, especially sugars, are the food that fuel all life on Earth. What this means is that all food is really stored energy from the sun. When we talk about autotrophic organisms in an ecosystem, we sometimes call them producers. That is because they produce their own food. They produce food for all organisms that cannot make their own food. Every time a giraffe chews on leaves, it has the tree to thank for providing its meal. Every time a butterfly sips nectar, it has the plant to thank for providing its meal. Organisms that have to eat food. Heterotrophs, organisms that cannot make food themselves, must eat other organisms. In an ecosystem, heterotrophs are called consumers because they consume food rather than produce it. All animals, including humans, are heterotrophs. Fungi and most bacteria are also heterotrophs. Although they are so small that you cannot see bacteria feeding, you can see the evidence of their feeding. Yogurt, for instance, is a product of bacteria that eat milk. These bacteria, which live in milk, eat the milk protein and excrete a material that makes the milk thicken. All heterotrophs need to eat, but they do not all eat alike. Some only eat plants. These organisms are called herbivores or primary consumers. Others eat only animals. These heterotrophs are called carnivores. Still others need both plants and animals, and these are called omnivores. The types of food that an organism eats is one thing that defines an organism's way of life. Organisms that are carnivores, for example, have to find, catch, and kill their food. Over time, populations of these organisms developed adaptations so they can be successful at this challenging task. An important type of heterotroph is the decomposer, which feeds on dead organisms and waste material. Millipedes, mushrooms, molds, and bacteria are all examples of decomposers. Decomposers help break down waste and the dead by feeding on them, returning their molecules to the ecosystem, and enriching the soil in which autotrophs grow. You could compare decomposers to garbage disposals. Without decomposers, dead organisms and waste would pile up. Relationships among organisms in an ecosystem. In any ecosystem, producers and consumers have complex relationships based on how each organism gets its food and the energy that the food contains. The movement of energy is often modeled through food chains and food webs. A food chain is a visual representation of a single pathway from which energy might flow. For example, a food chain may include clover, producer, which is eaten by a rabbit, a primary consumer, which is eaten by a red fox, a secondary consumer, which is then eaten by a cougar, a tertiary consumer. In a food chain, the term primary, secondary, and tertiary let you know how far away from the consumer it is the producers. Different levels are also called trophic levels. Organisms in the same trophic level obtain energy in similar manners. For example, two primary consumers would both consume plants, and two producers would both capture the energy in sunlight for photosynthesis. In different food chains, the same organism may exist in different trophic levels. When many food chains from an ecosystem combine, they create a food web. A food web shows the complexity of feeding relationships in an ecosystem. Feeding relationships also define how the sun's energy, called trophic energy, is distributed on Earth. The distribution of trophic energy in an ecosystem depends on the feeding relationships within the ecosystem. Many different types of feeding relationships can exist in one ecosystem. Because relationships among organisms in ecosystems are independent, if an organism is removed, it affects all the organisms, even though they may not be directly feeding on each other. So, once again, this was the article Whom Eats Whom. And if you have any questions, please contact your teacher.